Welcome back, everyone. So we are running 8 minutes late, and I say 8 because we have to be very mindful of time. And I understand some of you have to go for another panel, some other engagement, etc. And it's also a long day for many of you. But again, thanks for sticking back. Now, I have a question for you before I even introduce the panelists. How many of you have been to conferences on racism where there has been a discussion on Islamophobia? Anyone? Come on. Other than this conference, and how many of you have been to conferences on racism where there's discussion on anti-Semitism? So very few, okay? And you have to think, why is that the case, right? And I'm not giving an answer, we're not looking at, but why is that the case that when we are talking of racism, which is a certain kind of prejudices, in general, focuses on one kind, not the other kind, when if you look at various things, maybe we'll learn more and we'll learn more to how to tackle all of them together. Maybe that's right. But I wanted to ask you, because personally I have never been to any conference on racism, and I have been to many, where there has been any discussion on anti-Semitism. I've been to few, there was some discussion on Islamophobia, but one part, right? That's the beginning. Anyway, so I'll not introduce myself. I'm here already, as you can see in the photo. I wanted to introduce you to the two speakers, but then rather than me introducing them, I'll ask them to introduce themselves very briefly. And we are all following different panel formats, by the way, right? Each panel. So I asked each one of them to speak for 7 minutes based on their recent book. For Dave Rich, this is the book. And Camila, that's the book, right? So just speak for 7 minutes based on that. Then I have a few questions for them based on what they argue and based on the broader theme of, in this case, anti-Semitism, racism. And then we'll have plenty of time for audience question and answer. So let me start with Dave. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, thank you. Microphone. Thank you, Dibyesh. Look, firstly, thank you for inviting me to speak. And I just want to echo what you've just said. Thank you for putting on a panel about anti-Semitism in a conference about racism and anti-racism, because it is unusual. And the fact that it is so unusual highlights one of the problems that I think we have and that I think we collectively need to find a way to deal with. And that is reconnecting anti-Semitism and tackling anti-Semitism with anti-racism. And I think there's a few reasons why they become separate, but essentially there's a lot of confusion over what anti-Semitism is. And this is one reason why I wrote this book, and this is one of the things this book is about. Is anti-Semitism a form of racism? Is it a form of religious prejudice? Is it something else entirely? And this connects to a lot of confusion about who Jewish people are. Are Jews a race, an ethnicity, a religion, a people, or some other category that doesn't have a name? And because of this, as soon as you start talking about anti-Semitism in the context of racism, it confuses and it complicates the discussion. So I'll give an example. In the previous panel, which I thought was a fascinating panel, and I'm very pleased there was also a panel on Islamophobia, there was a lot of discussion about racism as being intimately connected to whiteness and ideas of whiteness and emanating from whiteness and white supremacy. Now, if our understanding of racism is limited to or connected to or defined by our understanding of whiteness, it simply can't capture all the different ways in which anti-Semitism works in the world today and has worked in the world today. It cannot explain to you why Kanye West went on an anti-Semitic rant last year that concluded with him saying Hitler was a great man and going to dinner with Donald Trump and one of America's best-known white supremacist Holocaust deniers. Now, I'm not, my son loves Kanye West. I just have to put that on the record. And he's struggling with this as a Jewish teenager because it challenges his sense of how much he can still love his favorite rap artist. But you can't explain that as anti-Semitism if we only understand it as whiteness. Now, if you study anti-Semitism, one of the things you quickly come to realize is that it's not limited to one political ideology or another. It's not limited to one country or one type of society or another. It's not limited to one kind of religion or another, or one period of history or another. And you find anti-Semitic ideas and beliefs being expressed by some of the most powerful and wealthiest and influential people in society, and also by people who have no stake and nothing and are at the bottom of the social pile. It appeals across the spectrum. And connecting all of these things is an idea about Jewish people that essentially comes down to this kind of conspiracy idea that you can't trust Jews. They're always up to something. They're too rich, they're too powerful, and they've always got some sort of hidden agenda. And if something's going wrong in the world, there'll be Jews pulling the strings somewhere. And that's, broadly what Kanye was on about, but lots of other people too. Now, throughout all of this is an idea that there is an essence of Jewishness that connects all Jewish people. It doesn't matter how religious they are. It doesn't matter if they're Israeli or they live in the diaspora. It doesn't matter if they're rich or poor. All Jews have this essence, this character that marks them out. And that is where you get the racialization of Jews, is through that idea. And this idea predates racism as we understand it. It predates discourses of race that we recognize today. But there are continuities. I'll give you an example. In 1348 and 1349, the bubonic plague ravaged Europe. Between a third and a half of the population of Europe died in the plague. And in parts of what is now Eastern France, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, kind of that Central European belt, the idea grew that the plague was happening because Jews were putting poison in the wells, and that's why people were dying. And people took this very seriously. Jews were put on trial, they were tortured, they were killed en masse. Entire Jewish communities were either burnt to death or expelled because people thought this is how to stop the plague affecting our town or our village. Now, a few years ago, a couple of German economists had the idea of looking at the towns in Germany that did this and comparing it to support for Nazism in those same towns in the 1920s and 1930s, 600 years later. And what they found was a clear correlation. If you accounted for size of the town, economic background, geography, demography, every other variable, and you controlled for all of those, what you found is the places that expelled or massacred Jews during the bubonic plague in the 1340s were also more likely to vote for the Nazi Party in the 1920s, more likely to attack their local synagogue, more likely to deport Jews under Nazism, more likely to write letters to Nazi newspapers in the 1930s, and so on and so on. Now, I'm a historian, not a sociologist, so I'm not going to try and explain why that happened. I think it's a remarkable finding that over 600 years you get these continuities. But the point is, Nazi anti-Semitism was entirely racial. Jews were entirely demonized and separated out and ultimately exterminated and treated through racist terms as being viewed as a racially inferior group. That's what Nazi anti-Semitism was. And yet, it drew on specific ideas, but also broader cultural understandings of this Jewish essence I'm talking about, that long predate racist ideas and the whole discourse of race becoming dominant as it was in the early part of the 20th century in Europe. So to understand anti-Semitism, we have to be able to connect it to racism, but also not assume it is entirely congruent. Look for the overlaps, but also look for the differences. That's right.
Thank you. Camila, Dr. Camila Bassi.
Thank you, Dibyesh, and thanks very much for the invite today. I'm an academic human geographer from Sheffield Hallam University, and it's an honour to share the panel with Dave. So I was introduced to the academic literature on the study of racism as an undergraduate in the mid-1990s. And I was particularly drawn to the work of the scholar, Professor Robert Miles. And in 1989, in his Routledge Key Ideas book, Racism, he states the following: much of the British and North American theorising about capitalism and racism since the 1960s, while drawing upon the immoral status of racism, which derives to a significant degree from the final solution, utilises a colonial model, which has little scope to explain much of the European racism of the 19th and 20th centuries, and certainly not that form of racism which others label anti-Semitism. It does, however, have a relevance to the controversial debate about whether or not Zionism can be defined as an instance of racism. So then and now, it seems to me that what Robert Miles refers to as a colonial model of racism is a critical part of the explanation to the subtitle of my book, Outcast, which is out in June, How Jews Were Banished from the Anti-Racist Imagination. Colonialism was an integral moment in the history of racism. In Outcast, while I show colonialism as an integral moment in the history of racism, through the work of Robert Miles and others such as George Mosser, I show how it was the articulation between the capitalist mode of production and the nation state, rather than between capitalism and colonialism, that mapped the primary set of social relations within which racism had its origins and its initial effects. So through this more holistic history of racism, I'm able to trace anti-Jewish racism and to explain its ideological nature. I'm able to explore how racism targeted colonized and non-colonized populations and populations inside and out of Europe. And I'm able to demonstrate how the markers of race were not just skin colour. They were skin colour, but they were not just skin colour. For example, language featured centrally as an indicator of race. And in the case of the Jews, their seeming invisibility and ability to assimilate has long been part of their negative racial signification. In Outcast, I explore the ideology of racism and therein the idea of race, its social construction. And in the case of anti-Jewish racism on the left, that presents in the idea of the Jewish question. Now, the Jewish question is defined by the academics Robert Fine and Philip Spencer as follows: the classic term for the representation of Jews as harmful to humanity as a whole. So the Jewish question is, what is to be done with the harmful Jews? Now, I think for much of the contemporary left, not all of the left, but for much of the contemporary left, their vision of universalism and their struggle towards a common humanity has so far failed to escape the Jewish question, including the demand that ordinary Jews must become exceptional Jews, that they specifically must become comrades in the mission to absolutely defeat and erase the Jewish nation state and its blemish on humanity. For much of the left, Jews have been banished as victims of racism as a consequence of their demotion as racist pariahs. The ghost of Israel-Palestine haunts the current separatism between racism and anti-Semitism, observe Glynis Cousin and Robert Fine. Now, I've been aware for a long time of the academic literature on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, in the main coming from a post-colonial academic left tradition that damns and dooms Israel as an exceptionally deplorable colonialism, imperialism, nationalism, and racism. And in writing Outcast, I've come to understand how this academic body of work effectively fuses a colonial model of racism with the Jewish question. So the post-colonial academic left employ a settler colonialism paradigm to Israel-Palestine, which potentially opens up a wide range of sites of comparison. However, as Rachel Busbridge observes, in actuality, there is a particularly strong emphasis on white European settler colonialism to the omission of other settler colonial relationships, such as Russia, Chechnya, and China, Tibet. Indeed, one of the main theoreticians of the settler colonialism paradigm, Lorenzo Veracini, concedes, regardless of it being a comparative framework that potentially covers, I quote, a vast array of locales, a significant part of the output has been about Palestine. Moreover, I quote again, appraising Zionism and settler colonialism in the same interpretive framework does not amount to saying that Zionism is just like other settler colonialisms. In Outcast, I demonstrate how academic criticism of the Israeli state and military repression of the Palestinians is exceptionalized. And it's exceptionalized through the following assertions. What is to be done with a nation state guilty of ethnic cleansing and racism on par with South African apartheid and Nazi Germany? What is to be done with Zionism's national racism that has even gone so far as to historically present itself as socialist? What is to be done with so-called left-wing Jews who fail to see the origins of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in 1948, not 1967? What is to be done with Jews that have failed to learn their lesson from the Holocaust? What is to be done with an innate drive within Zionism and Zionist Jews to ethnically cleanse to the destiny of genocide? The answer, it seems almost universal within this academic body of work: undo Israel, completely. Now, by way of hope, I present an alternative tradition, a universalist Marxist critique of colonialism, imperialism, nationalism and racism in a universalist anti-racist imagination and struggle for political and human imagination. Notably, I resuscitate the lost legacy of work by the late scholar Maxine Rodinson. Maxine Rodinson pioneered the concept of Israel as a colonial settler state, a concept that evolved into the settler colonial paradigm, taken up in post-colonial studies. Yet him as the original theorist has effectively been ditched. Why? Because Rodinson was able to recognize the colonial and racist dimensions of the Israeli nation state. He acknowledged Israel as a historical error and an injustice to the Palestinians. At the same time, he nonetheless understood the conflict as one that wasn't exceptional, and as the conflict as not one as exceptionally demanding the erasure of Israel proper. Rodinson was able to call out and assess the anti-Semitic anti-Zionism, both within the left, the European left, and across the Arab world. And he was able to comprehend and plead for what he recognized as the only feasible solution to the conflict: two nations, two states. So I'm going to stop there because there's going to be, I'm sure, some probing questions, and then I'll come in a bit. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. In fact, first is for Dave, right? I mean, there's a particular sentence of yours which I really like. There's another one, but it says, anti-Semitism is not merely a bad idea or a nasty prejudice. It is an organizing principle for extreme, violent, deadly politics, right? So, and I did like, because could you expand on that? Of course, we do know the examples from history, but even from contemporary examples, if you could illustrate that, how it is an organizing principle rather than simply a prejudice.
So I'll explain what I meant by that line, because we've had some debate about the difference in prejudice and racism and the way that power plays a role within the differences and similarities there. So anti-Semitism in one level, obviously, is a kind of xenophobic dislike of Jewish people because they're different. But that doesn't really get to the heart of it. At the heart of it is this idea that I described, this conspiracy theory about Jews, that Jews are behind what is going wrong in the world, and that there is a Jewish plot to control banks and the media and politicians and so on and so on. Now, the point about this is that it is an idea that has been put to use by political leaders, governments, political parties, and other agitators many, many times in many different settings, in different countries and in different centuries. And it has power as an idea because it identifies a scapegoat, it identifies an enemy. It has proven time and time again the ability to mobilize people at different levels of society. So it's a political idea, and the key thing about it is that it retains that power even if there are no Jews present. So there were over 3 million Jewish people living in Poland before the Holocaust. After the Holocaust, there were around 30,000 left. In 1968, the communist government in Poland at the time organized what they called an anti-Zionist campaign, but what was in fact an anti-Semitic campaign, that whipped up a huge amount of activism and hatred towards what they argued was a Zionist cosmopolitan conspiracy to blame for all sorts of stuff going on in Poland at the time. Now, there were hardly any Jews left, only 30,000, and they were powerless in the context of Poland at that time. You can look at many other countries as well. You can look at the politics in, there are examples in politics in Pakistan where different politicians will call each other Jewish when nobody's Jewish because it has a signifier, it has a label. So that's what I mean by the power to mobilize, and that's where this idea that people who argue that anti-Semitism is not a form of racism, it's just a prejudice, sometimes fall back on this idea that Jews have power. Now, there's two problems with this. One of them is that it plays into these same stereotypes, that Jews have power. And the other is it can be very, very short-sighted in terms of being very limited in time and place. So it's easy to look at contemporary Britain or contemporary United States and say, well, Jews are quite well integrated and, they're doing all right, so in the context of our current society, they've got power compared to other groups. Go back a couple of generations, even just in this country, and that wasn't the case. Never mind looking at other places. So, again, I would always encourage you that there are nuances and complexities to the interrelationship between these ideas that you always have to bear in mind if you want to really get a grasp on what anti-Semitism is.
And again, if you take example of Nazi Germany again, the whole idea was the German Jews were one of the most integrated Jews in Europe at any point in history. And let's say even economically, some of them are doing well, but that does not prevent Holocaust from taking place. So the whole idea that somehow a particular community has whatever kind of power at any point in time does not prevent them from facing genocide, and including Holocaust, right? Now, in terms of Camila, you at one point mentioned in your book, and there's a term which you use, I really liked it, which is Lawrence of Academia syndrome. So like Lawrence of Arabia syndrome, Lawrence of Academia syndrome, of where you, of course, there's the whole idea of Zionist monsters, where, of course, the post-colonial academic left then defends Palestinian. Right? So could you expand a bit on what did you mean by Lawrence of Academia syndrome?
Thanks, Dibyesh. So what I do when I look at the academic literature on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I look at how the Jewish collective is racialized, and Zionism and all Jews that are associated with Zionism are racialized as not just white, but ultra-white, so glaringly white, in fact, that they're invisible. They're the invisible hidden hand, the invisible threat. And the thing with racialization, the thing with racism, is that it's a dialectical signification. And vis-a-vis the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, there's another racialization that takes place. And within some of the literature that critiques the main body that I look at, there is the recognition that there isn't a rigorous critique of the politics of political Islam, Islamic fundamentalism or Islamism. And one of the authors that I draw on coins the phrase Lawrence of Academia syndrome. It's not my phrase, it's one that I quote. Now, just to be clear, vis-a-vis the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, suicide bombings were a feature of the Second Intifada. However, since the Second Intifada, the level, that the rate of suicide bombings has dropped. But what's interesting to me is how the Palestinian suicide bomber is dialectically racialized vis-a-vis the Zionist Jew. And what you see within the literature is this idea of blowback, that the suicide bomber is the product of Israeli racist regression. And so they're left with no other choice but to punch back. Within the literature, the conflict is described as asymmetric warfare, which it is. It's asymmetric warfare. But there's a romanticization of the suicide bomber as being able to kind of punch up a romanticisation of the Palestinian David able to kind of punch back against the Zionist Goliath. Now, the problem with that is that it falls into my enemy's enemy as my friend. There's no questioning of the politics of political Islam, Hamas, and there's no agencies kind of written out of the story as well. So there's a romanticisation of the suicide bomber, and there's a kind of writing out of agency and choice vis-a-vis that. So there's a dual racialisation going on. Israel and Israeli Jews are the racist aggressors, and the Palestinian suicide bomber is, in effect, anti-racist resistance. We might say that their means and their tactics that they're using are regrettable, but they're part of, in some way, the anti-racist resistance. So Ilan Pappé has talked about Hamas being a part of the decolonisation movement. He says, look, we can leave some questions like gender, sexuality, the nature of the state to another time, but they are part of the decolonisation resistance. And I do think that's problematic. I think it falls into a fetishisation and a racialisation.
Thank you again. So on hidden hand question, right? Because you mentioned, and we get that a lot. How many of you have heard that whole concept of that? There's the powerful Jews, the hidden hand of Jews. Have you heard of that? Do you know what I'm talking about? And I've said it in the past, if you speak Urdu or Hindi by any chance, we are talking Yahudi Sajish, Jewish conspiracy. So you're giving an example of Pakistan, for instance, where I think there's one Jewish person, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, because on Twitter, he did support Israel on something else, and he was abused for that. That's how I know there was one person there. That everyone looks for Jewish conspiracy even when Jews do not exist, right? So what does this hidden hand thing do? And if you take example of anti-racism and bring it back, so there's there's an awareness broadly on the left, not necessarily, but broadly on the left that being racist is not right. We need to be anti-racist. We need to have struggle together. What does the hidden hand thing do? Because of course, if I talk of Corbyn phenomenon or what happened in Labour Party, a lot of defense of continuing anti-Semitism in Labour Party was that there's someone behind it. So the powerful forces. They might not use the word Jews, they might use the word Zionist. They might, and sometimes Israel, but they were very clear that there was a hidden hand. So in your experience, could you say a bit more about what does this hidden hand thing do apart from just being a stupid prejudice?
So one of the things it does is it enables anti-Semitism to just walk straight past people in plain sight and they don't notice that it's there. Because if you're looking for something that looks like a prejudice, but anti-Semitism appears in the clothing of a conspiracy theory, you won't spot it, or you might not spot it. And conspiracy theories are very popular nowadays. There's a load of very interesting opinion polling been done by Hope Not Hate, which is an anti-fascist organisation, looking at the popularity of conspiracy theories about QAnon and about COVID vaccines and about a whole range of other things and about Jews. And what this shows repeatedly is that conspiracy theories about anything are more popular amongst younger people, and therefore conspiracy theories about Jews are more popular, and especially if you get most of your news from social media. So those sort of things go together. So what it means is anti-Semitism happens, people express anti-Semitic ideas, Jewish people jump in alarm, and other people, including anti-racist people on the progressive left, don't even see it. It slips by. And you talk about what happened in the Labour Party. A lot of the problems in the Labour Party came from this kind of separation in understanding of what we should be looking for when we look for anti-Semitism and how it's expressed and where it's expressed. Because anti-Semitism in this form can look very much like an attack on the powerful, on an attempt to unmask and dismantle those who have power, those who control, global institutions, the whole network of capitalism, the whole network of banking and global finance. And time again, we see conspiratorial ideas and stereotypes and myths about Jewish people and about this essence of Jewishness being connected to money and finance and power, and it just slips by in plain sight, and people don't even realize what they're seeing and what they're watching. Anyone here who's been to see the play The Layman Trilogy, that's exactly what's going on in that play. So that's what it does. It kind of opens a door that ought to be shut, and then it builds an argument that says it's not enough to be opposed to capitalism, you need to be opposed to Jewish capitalism or to Zionist capitalism. It's not enough to oppose the banks. The way to learn about why the banks are evil is to watch this video about the Rothschilds. Videos about the Rothschilds, meanwhile, trended on TikTok in November and December and January this year, and nobody above the age of 16 noticed, unless, like me, they had a 16-year-old to tell them. These things are spreading and spreading and spreading, and there's kind of no barrier.
Can I just come in? Yeah, if I may. So, conspiratorial racialization is a central aspect of anti-Jewish racism, anti-Semitism, but it's also an aspect of Islamophobia as well, or anti-Muslim racism. So the idea that Muslims are going to take over Europe, I think is one example. Thinking about India, the Love Jihad campaign, which was waged, this idea of Muslims, forcing themselves onto Hindu women. So it's interesting. Dave's right. We are living in an age where it really does feel like conspiracy theories are on the rise, and I think that is a danger for all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia.
Sorry, just to pick up on this, just because I'm not sure I explained properly why it's dangerous. So right now in the United States, there's a trial about to start of a man called Robert Bowers. In October 2018, Robert Bowers went into a synagogue in Pittsburgh and shot dead 11 Jewish people who were at their Shabbat morning prayer that Saturday morning. Robert Bowers was a neo-Nazi, and he believed in a conspiracy theory called the Great Replacement Theory, which argues that immigration into the United States and into Europe is not just a fact of life or, a product of globalization or people wanting a better life. It's a deliberately engineered plot by Jews, such as George Soros and others, to replace and destroy the white race as they see it, as neo-Nazis see it. Now, it's a crazy conspiracy theory. It's Islamophobic as well as anti-Semitic. But Robert Bowers believed in it enough that he committed mass murder in a synagogue because he thought the Jews were to blame for the fact that he saw immigrants in his local area. So when we talk about why does it matter that people believe conspiracy theories about Jews, and how can it mobilize people, it really can mobilize to the ultimate extreme of what anti-Semitism can be.
Thanks. On that, there's one point which you make, and that was a very powerful point. I would want you to expand that, because you hardly come across racists who say, I'm a racist. They say, I'm not racist, but I'm not homophobic, but, I've got someone, that kind of thing. So same way in case of anti-Semitism, what I've found is most of them will say, of course I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist, right? So that's a common trope that a lot of people use. And it's true that some anti-Zionists might not be anti-Semitic, but some of them might be anti-Semitic. But for them, it's quite clear that the moment they say we're anti-Zionist, somehow then they don't need to excuse anything. They can say anything they want to, right? And so you talk about how the genocide of the victims turned persecuted. So you're talking about how Jews are seen as those, yes, who were victimized in the past in Europe, but look at that, what they're doing now. And could you expand a bit about how the image of, and that's what they use. They say, yeah, of course, Jews were victims, we're not denying it, but now they're victimizing Palestinians. To what extent that plays a very dangerous and dubious role in actually perpetrating anti-Semitism?
Okay, thanks, Dibyesh. So the common retort on the left that I've come across when the issue of anti-Jewish racism is raised is a definition of anti-Semitism as we're not, hostility to Jews. So we're not hostile to Jews as Jews is the defence. And I think the issue with anti-Jewish racism on the left is that it's a dialectical signification of the good Jew and the bad Jew, the exceptional Jew and the ordinary Jew. And there's a unnecessary and exceptional expectation that is placed on Jewish people. So if you are prepared to deny anti-Semitism on the left, and if you are prepared to denounce Zionism, and if you are prepared to call for the destruction of Israel, then you're a good Jew. But if you're not prepared to do any of those things, then you will remain damned and doomed as a bad Jew. And I guess part of that dialectical racialization of the good and the bad Jew ties into your question, Dibyesh, which is there is a expectation on Jews as victims of the Holocaust to be exceptional people. Now, my parents grew up in the Punjab, which was a state that was central to the partition of India and Pakistan. There are members of my extended family back in India during the partition of India that were victims of the violence and were perpetrators of the violence. And at no point in any of my years on the left, and I've been on the far left since, been active on the far left since 1996, no one has ever called on me to denounce the role of some of my community in the violence of the partition. I'm not singled out. I'm not exceptionalized yet. Jewish people are exceptionalized, and I find that the issue. And I think Hannah Arendt talked about how during the Enlightenment, the expectation on the Jew to enter the door into an equal society was to become not just an exceptional Jew, different and more educated than other Jews, but an exceptional specimen of humanity. But why is it that the Jewish person has to do that, whereas the rest of us are almost left alone and not essentialized, racially essentialized in the same way?
Thank you. On that, I mean, because both of you have pointed in your book, and we know this whole idea of good Jew versus bad Jew, and then in most cases, those who'd be accused of, and we're talking broadly of the left, we're not talking about the far right, and so we're talking about the left, the idea that, and they refer to Chomsky, and Chomsky is a common example, or they'll refer to someone else, Ilan Pape, or they'll always refer to an anti-Zionist Jewish person to then justify all the politics they have. What pressures have you been under to not be, because you'd be a bad Jew in that context, right?
Very bad.
Because of, so the very fact that you write this book, the very fact that you've been campaigning endlessly and with Community Security Trust and others, you're working hard to make sure that Jewish people, children and adults are also safe here in the country, you'd be not seen as a good Jew but as a bad Jew. So I'm just wondering, how do you deal with that?
So, I mean, to illustrate what you mean, so in my day job, I work for a Jewish charity, the Community Security Trust, that provides security and protection and support for Jewish people in Britain who face anti-Semitism. And we provide support to people who experience hate crime and so on. We don't do any pro-Israel advocacy, anything like that. Our focus is anti-Semitism here in Britain. I very, very rarely tweet anything about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But what I do tweet about a lot is anti-Semitism here in Britain. And whenever I tweet about anti-Semitism here in Britain, especially if it involves anyone or anything from the left, the replies I get back are, you're just defending apartheid. You're a war criminal. You support. I get people tweeting pictures of dead Palestinian children at me in reply to me tweeting something about some anti-Semitic comment someone in this country, a public figure in this country has made. So that's what we're talking about, is there's a certain attitude that refuses to engage with the very idea or issue of anti-Semitism here in Britain because Israel. And that's the answer to everything, and it closes everything down. And that's what comes to, and the excuse then often is, but here's the good Jews, who these tweeters approve of, who basically provide them with the excuse to direct abuse at every other Jew. Now, I would going to hazard a guess that anyone from a minority background is familiar with this dynamic, because it happens a lot, and I'm not claiming it only happens to Jewish people at all. Now, there is a diversity of opinion in the Jewish world about Israel and about Zionism. There always has been, and that's completely normal, and fine. It's Jewish politics, it's whatever. People have different opinions. When it turns nasty is when wider politics grabs hold of some of that and uses it as a stick to bash all the others, basically. And when I do, I do a lot of interviews and media stuff and so on, and when I get asked, when I'm talking about anti-Semitism, and I get asked, but do you support a two-state solution, or what do you think about settlements, or what do you think about this or that, I will always refuse to answer, because it shouldn't matter. My right to live free from prejudice and harassment and abuse in this country as a Jewish person should not be affected by what I do or don't think about what's happening in Israel. Maybe I have strong opinions about it, maybe I don't, but it shouldn't be relevant to that issue.
In fact, you're right. I mean, I've seen your tweet on Twitter and many other people. The moment you write, you can write X, Y, Z, it doesn't matter. The moment you write, people would put, and even something tragedy about an attack in synagogue, people say Free Palestine. I've noticed that. And that's where the difference is, that one can talk of Free Palestine, free anything at any point in time, but connecting it to a tragedy that's happening elsewhere is where the anti-Semitism is so obvious, right? Now, one final thing which I had for you was, I was going to ask you all, how many, and this is, because we have to be sensitive, but it's a learning process for many of us. So, and I've said that in the past publicly, but I recall in the past, I've once, and only once I compared Israel's policy to Nazi Germany. I remember that, right? And I did it because, of course, for me it was a rhetorical point to make. It's only later that once I thought more about it, I learned that how offensive that is. And I mean, not only for you and you who have researched, you know how offensive it is. If I may ask, how many of you have ever compared Israel to Nazi Germany? Well, you're recorded, but no one will see you. Anyone? No? So maybe I was the only one. That's fine. Good. There's a reason I'm asking that. Because I've come across that often. And it is like, you can talk of genocide. Genocides have taken place in many places. But why compare an attack or dehumanization or genocide in one place always to Holocaust if you want to make a political point? And coming back to what you said, and the question I asked you is, in my view, what it does is, by saying, Jews were victims and look, now they're the perpetrators, is to partly ignore the victimization. Most people who, on social media and including academia, when they talk of, yes, Jews did suffer, but look at what they do now, actually never look at what Jews suffered. So I've never seen them ever write about Holocaust. But they will say, yes, we do acknowledge Holocaust took place, but what are they doing now? So in one sense, even the superficial acknowledgement of that past as a victimization is used to actually beat them up with what is happening now. Going back to what you were saying is, you might be talking anti-Semitism, it will be brought down to Israel-Palestine always. Sometimes it is connected, and we can't deny that it can be connected in some context, but because especially the attacks on Jewish people rises around certain particular times when the conflict is higher there. Yet, what I get from you both in your book and what you're pointing out, that this exceptionalization of both the Jews and Israel also, as you pointed out, is it's a remarkable phenomenon, not a positive, a remarkable phenomenon. Because in my own work, I've worked on China, that's my main work, China, Uyghurs, China, Tibetans, and often India and Kashmiris. The level of oppression is also there. There's occupation there. But I have never come across on any left circle anyone calling for boycott, divestment, sanction of India or of China. In fact, I found the same people who will talk of dehumanization, anti-occupation are quite fine with going to China if they're allowed to go to China and if they're allowed to. So this whole hypocrisy there. And that's why the reason we are talking of left, of course, is because we assume the right to do it. I mean, far right will do it, but not the far left. On that note, I have a couple of other points to make, but I'll keep it for that because we don't have enough time. Questions, comments? Okay. I know Joshua was the first, then let's go with the. Oh, you take. I will take it.
Is there another? Oh, there's another microphone.
Okay. So we'll take those three first, and then the last three first. Let's see. We'll take three questions together and answer, right?
Thank you. Stand up, I think. I kind of had the thought, like reading a bit about in my dissertation proposal, which focused on the question: is anti-Semitism an ideology? And I came across the concepts of not just anti-Semitism but anti-Judaism. And I noticed that there's a margin. Of course, anti-Semitism to a certain extent derives from anti-Judaism. But would you still say that in today's form, what we call in contemporary terms anti-Semitism is more related to what we might call anti-Judaism? And also, because you mentioned anti-Zionism quite a lot, would you, to a certain extent, include anti-Zionism into that same or in a similar discussion?
Yeah, hi. I think this is a topic that I'm naturally a bit uncomfortable of asking. I don't know if that's because of the exceptionalism you talked about earlier when it comes to Jews or Israel. Yeah, I'm actually very comfortable talking about it. But I just wanted to know the panel point of view on what Diane Abbott was talking about and why she's been demonized for what I think she said was not nicely, she didn't word it nicely, but I think I got the point of what she was saying. And all she got, for me, goes back to the work we're trying to do, muting blackness even further. So I just want to know the panel point of view on that.
Thank you. And
Yes, what I would say is that in order to combat forms of racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and other forms of racial prejudice which are institutionalized in our culture, one of the tools that we have available is to share stories. And in that respect, I would share two stories which are underrepresented in our culture. And one is from Nazi Germany itself. Now, it's a little known historical record, but there was a Punjabi, South Asian, Islamic Ahmadiyya grouping that elevated a Jewish homosexual to leadership level within their ranks in part opposition to the Nazis. Now, this is in Germany during the Nazi hegemony, yes? And that's a story that I feel that if we were to share this, and we would share more stories like this, we would be able to unravel our self-images in a much more productive way. And the other story, which is equally important, and also from the subcontinent, is, in our culture today, Bollywood is celebrated, but it's a little known fact that Bollywood, in its inception, in its forensic DNA, was very taboo. Filmmaking and acting and all the rest of it was caste-ridden in the subcontinent. And it was through pioneering Jewish filmmakers and actresses that we have Bollywood in its form today. Now, if this was to be shared as it ought to be, as we ought to share other stories, we can combat understandings of human beings that represent these different cultures.
Thank you so much. Comments will come next round. So one was around ideology, second was around Diane Abbott, and third was more of a comment on stories. Yeah, thanks.
So on the first question of is anti-Semitism an ideology, I mean, there are different opinions about this. Anthony Julius, in his History of English Anti-Semitism, wrote that it's not an ideology itself, it just pollutes every other ideology, which I think is an interesting way to look at it. I do think we can sometimes get a bit distracted by terminology here in terms of anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism. Because, and we have to remember in all of this, the word anti-Semitism was invented by an anti-Semite to give respectability and credibility to his anti-Judaism. It was invented by a German anti-Semite called Wilhelm Marr, who was launching a political party in the 1870s and wanted to sound respectable and scientific and racialist in the language of the time. It's not a word invented by Jews, but we're kind of stuck with it. But you do get some anti-Semitism which is very obviously racialized. So the cartoon in The Guardian last week of Richard Sharp, the Jewish outgoing chair of the BBC, which The Guardian took down because it was anti-Semitic, that was very much a Jewish banker drawn in racialized facial terms. You do get anti-Semitism that targets symbols of religiosity. Synagogues are often the primary target for anti-Jewish terrorism and so on. So there's overlaps. And would I include anti-Zionism in that? Sometimes, is my short answer. You do get anti-Zionism expressed in terms that are conspiratorial, that use anti-Jewish tropes and stereotypes, but just swap in the word Zionist. Then there's the whole issue of why is it that in all the conflicts in the world, this is the one where the solution people offer is just to get rid of one of the countries. But it's a whole other discussion. Look, on Diane Abbott, the first thing I'd say is the reaction from a lot of people in my world who I spoke to about it, in the kind of Jewish community world, was sadness, actually, because Diane Abbott has done so much, firstly done so much against racism in politics and public life, and certainly still probably attracts more racism than any other person in public life. Now, the problem with her letter is that what she wrote was white people who present as white, and the three examples she gave were Jews, travelers, and Irish people, do not face racism. What they face is prejudice comparable to the kind of bullying or prejudice that people with ginger hair experience. Now, a lot of Jewish people found this incredibly insulting because it relegates the Jewish experience, it diminishes it. It's also, and she then went on to argue that they may face prejudice, but they don't face structural racism, structural discrimination, and that's the difference. Now, the one thing I'd say is Roma communities across Europe today still face extensive structural discrimination. So there's a factual inaccuracy there. But I think the sadness is that implicit in the letter was a hierarchy, an argument of competition and hierarchy, and that's the exact opposite of what we actually need. And I would like to think that if I was able to have this conversation with Diane Abbott, she would agree with that, actually, that we don't want this hierarchy and nobody benefits from that kind of competitiveness. So I think that was the issue, but I do think ultimately it was just quite sad, actually, the way it played out. In terms of sharing stories, absolutely, I love the Bollywood story. There are lots of attempts to do this. There was a mosque in Golders Green, which is a very Jewish area of London, that a few years ago tried to host an exhibition showing how Albanians rescued Jews during the Holocaust, with Albania being a predominantly Muslim country. Great idea, I love it. What happened was there were extremists who hated the idea and who pressured the mosque not to do it. And we're always going to be facing that pushback, but I do think the more of these connectivity stories we can tell, the better.
Thanks, Dibyesh. Really good contributions from the floor. Thank you. I think racism is an ideology. I think I define anti-Semitism as anti-Jewish racism. Ideology is, an explanation of the world, a way of making sense of the world. It's racism as an ideology is a false explanation of the world. It's contradictory, it's incoherent, it's, in a Gramscian sense, a common sense ideology, but it is ideological. There's a prehistory to racism and there's a history to racism, but there's often this idea that racial science was coherent, and actually every attempt by scientists to classify race collapsed under the weight of empirical evidence. So racial science wasn't this kind of fixed, innate thing. And in fact, a lot of the key ideas and explanations of racial science were starting to collapse in the early 1930s, regardless of the fact that the final solution was still gearing up to happen. Yes, there's a distinction between religious anti-Semitism and racial anti-Semitism, but it wasn't a clean break. The prehistory of prejudice against the Jews informed racial prejudice against the Jews. And I think that's really important. And the same with anti-Muslim racism. There's a prehistory to that, and there's a prehistory to hostility to the Jews. The question about Diane Abbott. Firstly, she apologised, which I think is important to recognise. I think on the basis of that, she should have been readmitted to the Labour Party. She was wrong, but I think the wider issue for me is that actually she represents a much wider ideological current within the anti-racist imagination and struggle that is based on a colonial model of racism that sees racism only through colonialism. And actually, if you look more holistically at racism, then you have to include the intersection of racism, not just with colonialism, but with nationalism and wider capitalist social relations. One of the things that I came across on social media that was kind of discussing and I guess loosely debating the Diane Abbott comment is this idea of imperial boomerang. I'd never come across that before, but and it came up in the last session, which is this idea that the Holocaust was, if you like, blowback for the crimes of colonialism abroad. And I do think that is problematic. I know that the term imperial boomerang is attributed to Hannah Arendt, but I've looked up all of her references in the origins to totalitarianism, and I think when she talked about imperial boomerang, I think it's been taken out of context here. I think it is really problematic to kind of solely attribute the cause of the Holocaust to kind of, I guess it's an interesting way of it fitting into the colonial model of racism, but it negates the very, very long prehistory and history of anti-Jewish racism. And finally, I like the story from the audience member right at the back. I've written elsewhere, not in my book, but about the intersectionality between Jewish people and gay people and trans people in the Weimar Republic, and how they were kind of specifically kind of targeted by the National Socialist Party. I think there's a really, really rich history of Jewish identity and trans identity that's really important, because one of the things I didn't put in my book, I have a long experience of witnessing anti-Jewish racism on the left, but where I'm seeing the most disturbing anti-Semitism at the moment is amongst gender-critical feminists, so-called feminists that are opposed to trans rights. I think there's you look at the work of, for example, Jennifer Billick, and she is espousing some really horrifying homophobic and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories around the so-called kind of transhumanism project that's taking over the world. So intersectionality, those stories from history are really important for the intersectional politics that we need today.
Thank you. A quick comment before one final round of question. Yes, sharing a story, these are important because, of course, that they defy, or rather they puncture the myth that people have in terms of simplicity story. But we also don't need to fetishize some of them, because if you go back to even histories of these, let's say even in terms of Jewish experience in India, what was seen as in India, there's good work being done by, I know a particular, and he's become a friend, Nafrez Afridi. He talks about, again, anti-Semitism in India. Not only amongst this whole Urdu press and Muslim press, but also in Kerala, which is seen as a progressive place. And Kerala is one of the most progressive states of India, one of the most developed states, but there's whole evidence of strong anti-Semitism there, but that's a state where you have got Jewish people also, right? So we have to understand, and also I think in both books, or one of your books, I was reading about how this, specifically, we hear about how, Palestinians are being victimized for crimes of Europeans, and how Jews are saved in Muslim world. They might have been saved in Muslim world, but they were not treated as we have to remember, they were not treated as equal in Muslim world also. So there was all kinds of problem there. Anyway, you can comment on that later if you want to, but we'll take final round of questions, all questions together, and then there. I know there was one there. If you could keep it brief, please. There was one, yeah? Alex, did you? No, okay, fine. The gentleman next to Alex there, and we have got you. Anyone else who wants to ask question or comment? Fine, we have two, that's okay. Yeah, please.
Bahauddin. A really deeply illuminating discussion, must say. there's a lot to take back from this discussion, it seems to me. What concerns me is that anti-Jewish racism is really deeply hardwired. As you said, it doesn't require Jewish presence or even knowledge of Jews for it to exist. So, for example, some years ago, if I remember correctly, in Japan, a anti-Jewish trope, a book, in fact, about Jews, became a bestseller in a country where actually there is no Jewish history at all. And then I recall meeting a Chinese professor from Peking University who told me, "Didn't you know about Jews?" And I said, "How do you know about Jews? Where did you come across Jews at Peking University, for heaven's sake?" But he said, "We know all about Jews." So when I'm saying that Jewish presence is not required, it seems to me the poison, European poison, as Mr. Rich stated earlier, it goes back to the 14th century. And that somehow, in the very locales where these pogroms took place, for some reason, 600 years later, in the same very area, that poison still existed. So I think what I really want to know from three of you, because three of you obviously know much more about this, what do we do about this poison? What is problematic is that, for example, for Muslims, the fascist, right-wing, neo-Nazi, white racists in Europe and America actually want to encourage friendship with Muslims, for example, who share a similar opinion. So it gives you some idea how they're willing to be linked up with people from other races if it means they can hurt Jews. What do we do about this? This problem seems to me so hardwired that it deserves to be, deserves some really heavy attention, legal or otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you. And one final question here.
I've just got one. Can we take two more?
Okay,
Just
two more. Yeah, I've seen your hand, but then I couldn't see you later.
Thank you all. I think just, drawing on your courage, I want to lean into discomfort and ask a question that is slightly uncomfortable for me. But I think, I noticed, Dave, you were speaking about how when you're invited to speak to, Israel and Palestine, that you named, I guess, that kind of the diversity of Jewish politics kind of being outside something that you feel drawn to speak to, or you won't kind of comment on it. And I was interested in that. I guess from where I am, and what this gentleman over here spoke to is how story speaks to the intersections of all these oppressions and the brutality of hierarchy and how that manifests in so many different ways. Anti-Semitism being one of them, also the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestine as a land also being one of them. And so, for me, I guess that invitation, the reflective question is to ask, where and who am I in this position to speak to? I think there's something about a labor required depending on our positions of power and the platforms that we hold. And so, I guess I'm with a question around, you do have a position where you have a voice and a platform to speak to a genocide that's happening, where many, people are literally being cleansed from their homeland. And at the same time, we can hold that complexity and hold the brutality of anti-Semitism as an experience. And I think that is where I'm interested in how can we hold all of that and speak to all of that with the platforms and positions and power that we hold to speak to truth, essentially, and using story as a means to do that.
Thank you. Final question here or comment? Zara,
Thank you. First of all, thank you both. It was really interesting to listen to. I want to echo some of the colleagues' reflections that sometimes asking questions in these spaces can be quite challenging. And I think partly it's because of the lack of knowledge in this area, which is why it's so helpful sometimes to just sit back and listen. So I just wanted to first of all reflect and say thank you both for putting together your presentation so clearly, especially for those of us that don't have knowledge in this area, to be able to listen and take it in. So thank you for that. My question is really about how we talk about the interconnectedness of our experiences, because a lot of what you've said echoed the previous panel that was talking about Islamophobia, and there are points of convergence and points of divergence in those experiences. How do we have more of those conversations in spaces like the institution, where definitions like racism, for example, are narrowed in order to keep us in those separate boxes and to keep the conversations around Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and other forms of racism in isolated spaces, so there aren't those opportunities for us to come together like we are today?
Thank you.
Look, on the first question, anti-Semitism in some ways works better when there's no Jews around, because it's not a reaction to actual Jewish people and how they actually live and behave. It's an idea, it's a conception of a kind of mythical, abstract Jewish figure or Jewish power network that has been present for so long. It's one of the building blocks of our culture and our world. And that's one reason why it endures, and it's one reason why people don't always notice it, is because it's literally woven into the fabric of how we think, not about Jews, but about our society as a whole. And Jews, for a very, very long time, have held a special significance in how people think about the world. Certainly people from countries whose civilization is based on one of the Abrahamic faiths, I would say. And this can be good or bad. There are people who say they love Jews because Jews have a really important place in their cosmic understanding. And there are people who hate Jews in the same way, the same framing. And I have to say, speaking as a Jew, both make me feel uncomfortable. I know which one makes me feel more frightened, but they both make me feel uncomfortable. Now, moving on to the second question, I think there are elements of this special significance that our societies and our cultures have attached to Jews over many centuries that now attach themselves to Israel. So people respond to Israel, people in this country, and in other countries, but in this country, respond to Israel in a unique way. People who have no personal connection to the conflict, nevertheless respond to it in a unique way. Let me explain what I mean. There's no other conflict in the world, like I said, where the solution some people come up with is to say this country should disappear. Doesn't matter what Russia do in Ukraine, no one's ever going to say that about Russia. Doesn't matter what Saudi Arabia do in Yemen, with British arms, meanwhile. Saudi is the biggest purchaser of British arms in the world. No one's ever going to say Saudi Arabia shouldn't exist. It's historically more artificial than Israel is. When Israel last had a major war in Gaza in May 2021, we had a massive spike in anti-Semitic hate crimes here in this country. Now, in February last year, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was no comparable spike in anti-Russian hate crime in this country. I know this because I sit on a National Police Committee, hate crime committee, and I ask that question. So why? Why is that the case? That's my question. I'm not saying everyone who cares about Palestine is anti-Semitic. I don't believe they are. But what I'm saying is Jews trigger something because they've had this historic place in how people see our societies. Now, in terms of my platform is as a British Jew who talks about anti-Semitism in this country. And I will resist the pressure to talk about Israel-Palestine. I'm not Israeli. I don't live there. I don't pay taxes there. I don't vote there. My organization has no links to the Israeli government. Right? We're funded by British Jews. So I'm no more obliged than anyone else in this room to have an opinion about the conflict. And, you know, on a personal level, we may disagree a lot about the conflict, right? And I got no problem with disagreement, and I got no problem with discomfort, and I'm pleased you asked the question because this is supposed to be a place of learning. But what I'd say is there are 300,000 Jewish people in this country, and when things really kick off in Israel, and you get a spike in anti-Semitic hate crime, and you get massive demonstrations through our town centres in a way you do not get with any other overseas conflict, Jewish people in this country are scared when that happens. And I would question interpretations of power when you're talking about 300,000 very scared people who within 2, 3, 4 generations have a family history of refugee and migration and flight from persecution. So that's the framing that I bring to my understanding of how Israel-Palestine lands in this country.
Thank you. Again, 2 really good questions. That apologies if I misunderstood them in my answer. There's a really interesting exchange that David Baddiel has in the documentary Jews Don't Count between himself and Miriam Margolyes, and she says, of course we have to talk about Israel as Jewish people. And I think he says something like, well, just because I identify as Jewish, no, I don't have to talk about Israel. And it's strange, actually, because I actually felt some sympathy with David Baddiel, because actually, as humans, as socialists, as individuals committed to social justice, that are committed to a politics that's anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, yes, we should talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and we should talk about the plight of the Palestinians. That is essential to any kind of emancipatory politics. But just because somebody in the room identifies as Jewish doesn't mean that they have to be put on the spot to talk about Israel. I think that's the problem. But let's just flip it. At the moment, for several weeks now, there is a huge protest movement in Israel. Absolutely huge against Netanyahu's coalition government. And it's, politically wide-ranging, but there are very progressive political elements, tendencies within that protest movement. You read what the Socialist Workers' Party has to say about that protest movement, there's nothing to see here. It's written off because the Israeli Jewish working class is subsumed into the Israeli Jewish ruling class, and it's written off. There's no other working class anywhere else in the world that's written off, and I think that is deeply problematic. Where does the hope come from? There's a chapter in my book that talks about the work of Cornel West and Henry Louis Gates Jr., and their work on confronting black anti-Semitism, about recognising anti-Jewish racism and anti-black racism as bedfellows. There's a really interesting paper by the late Pinna Werbner. I had an exchange with her last year. I think she passed away sadly this year, in which she talks about the co-constructed racializations within the Palestinian-Israeli conflict between the Islamic Grand Inquisitor and the Jewish witch. And I think we need much more understanding within our anti-racist imagination and politics that understands multi-racisms, different kinds of racism as relational and co-constructed. I'm going to leave it there because we have run out of time, haven't we? Thank you.
And I'll just conclude by saying a couple of observations on this. When, for instance, this is a very common thing, especially on the left, we do acknowledge there's a problem, right? So when someone says there's an attack somewhere and we feel, oh gosh, hopefully it's not a Muslim, right? And many Muslims fear that, and we understand that. I have not come across anyone on the left who would say and ask a Muslim, go and what about Palestine? Sorry, not. What about Pakistan? What happens to Christians? Or what about Ahmadis? Or what about Saudi Arabia? There's usually not a question that's asked because broadly on the left we understand that's racist, unacceptable. But why is that acceptable when, for instance, and this is not only a question, but there's a very common question I know from Jewish students, colleagues, others, is questions asked about what's your view on Israel and Palestine? Even when they might have not been in politics, they might have no connection. And let's not forget in certain contexts, and I'll give my examples, I've worked broadly in different areas, including, on racism in general, anti-black racism. I've never come across anyone saying, why are you doing it? For instance, on Islamophobia, and I've worked on Islam for more than 20 years, by the way. My second book was on Islamophobia in India against Hindutva, far-right Hindutva. No one asked me, why are you doing it? Who's behind it? But since I've taken a bit more interest and started working on anti-Semitism, trying to platform different discussions of this kind, the attack on Twitter of who's behind it and asking who's funding you. That I had never, I had come across, by the way, if you think the most lethal Twitterati are Indians, the far-right Indians, but in my view. But that level of who's behind it, so my agency, that I might myself be educating myself, where I understand that saying and comparing, for instance, what Israel is doing with Nazism is unacceptable, insensitive, and acknowledge it, and I say it, I don't hide it, right? That is all seen as not me thinking myself. There's always an assumption that there's someone behind it, or there might be an agenda behind it, which goes back to the whole discussion we are having is, we are dealing with a form of racism, a type of racism, right? And yet, there's a resistance on part of the left, hopefully it's changing, the left to acknowledge it. Because if we do not even acknowledge it, then how will we work together to challenge it? On that note, let me thank both of you for joining me, and thank you. Right? And so we are running 15 minutes late, but remember next time we have got different people. One other aspect of racism, we talked of anti-Semitism being much longer than colonial form of racism. Think of casteism in India. Much longer, much more, I would say much more vicious, equally vicious, if not much more vicious, equally dehumanizing, and that has no connection to coloniality. In fact, it is the justified, the upper caste Indians will say, oh, it's all connected to coloniality. I'm just putting that forward because that's a discussion we'll be having apart from other things. Next panel, 15 minutes break, please have a tea, coffee, and come back. Thank you.